Dale had been working night security at the mall for 3 years, and nothing ever happened. It was the kind of mind-numbing job where the biggest excitement was catching a teenager sneaking in through an emergency exit. But that night, as he made his first round past the clothing store, something was off. The mannequins were different. He stopped, pressing his palm against the glass. He was sure they had been posed differently the last time he saw them. A trio of faceless figures stood in the window display, arms positioned as if mid-conversation. He could have sworn that earlier they had been standing in rigid, neutral stances. Dale shook his head. Maybe the store had some automatic display rotation, a motorized gimmick to make them look like they moved. Shrugging it off, he continued his round. The mall was empty, quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional groan of the air conditioning system. By the time he looped back around, something made his skin crawl. The mannequins had moved again. This time, one had turned its head ever so slightly toward the glass. Another had its arm raised, its plastic fingers reaching outward. His breath caught in his throat. He unlocked the side entrance of the store, stepping inside with his flashlight. The air smelled of fabric and something faintly chemical, like the plastic of the mannequins themselves. He approached the display, heart pounding. Up close, they looked normal, just lifeless figures, dressed in the latest fashion. He waved his hand in front of one's blank face, feeling ridiculous. Maybe he was overtired, his mind playing tricks on him. Shaking his head, he turned to leave. Something tapped on the glass. Dale spun around, flashlight beam sweeping the store. Nothing moved. His pulse hammered in his ears. He backed away, locking the store behind him, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He'd check the security footage later. Maybe some prankster was messing with him. He retreated to his station and rewound the feed from the last hour, watching the mannequins in the display. At first they remained still. Then, around the time of his first pass, the footage glitched. When it resumed, the mannequins had changed positions. His stomach dropped. He rewound it again. The footage jumped, the mannequins moved, and the static in the speakers crackled with something that almost sounded like whispering. Dale felt cold sweat trickle down his spine. He grabbed his flashlight and returned to the store. This time, as he approached, he could feel it, the undeniable sensation of being watched. The mannequins stood still, but their new poses made his skin crawl. One had pressed a hand flat against the glass, fingers splayed wide, as if testing the barrier between them. His breathing turned shallow. He wasn't imagining this. His radio crackled. "Dale, you there?" It was the voice of his coworker, Mark, who covered the opposite wing of the mall. Dale lifted the radio to his mouth. "Yeah, you near the West End?" "No, I'm by the food court. Why?" Dale hesitated. "Nothing. Just." He trailed off, heart hammering. One of the mannequins had tilted its head. He wasn't imagining it. The plastic joints didn't creak. They didn't shuffle their feet or shift their weight. 1 second they were still, and the next, they weren't. As if they moved in the blink of an eye. Dale stepped back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But then, the store lights flickered, buzzing loudly, and he swore he saw something in the reflection of the glass, something standing among the mannequins. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. The lights went out. The mall plunged into darkness, leaving only the dim glow of emergency exit signs. Dale's flashlight beam shook as he swung it wildly across the store. A faint scraping sound echoed from within. Something was moving inside. He ran. His boots pounded against the tile as he sprinted toward the security office. The radio slipped from his grip, clattering onto the floor behind him. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He slammed the office door shut, locking it behind him, gasping for breath. His shaking hands fumbled to pull up the camera feeds. The display store was pitch black. Then, one by one, the emergency lights flickered on again. Dale leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. The mannequins were no longer in the window. He flipped through the cameras, his breath coming in short gasps. The cameras lining the main walkway showed nothing. The food court was empty. The sporting goods store was silent. Then, he switched to the feed outside the security office. His blood turned to ice. One of the mannequins stood just outside the door. Its head was tilted, its faceless stare locked onto the camera. Dale stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his chair. The doorknob rattled. A click. The lock disengaged on its own. He lunged forward, shoving his weight against the door, forcing it closed again. His fingers fumbled for his keys, twisting the lock. The rattling continued, harder this time, like something slamming against the wood. He backed away, chest heaving. The security monitors flickered. Every camera feed filled with static, except for one. The break room camera. On the screen, a mannequin stood inside. Dale turned, staring at the break room door a few feet away. It was open just a crack, a sliver of darkness peeking through. He hadn't left it open. The lights cut out again. And then, right behind him, a whisper. His breath hitched, and before he could turn, a cold, rigid hand gripped his shoulder. The last thing he heard before darkness consumed him was the faint sound of plastic joints creaking, followed by the distant echo of footsteps many to count moving closer. The underground parking lot was eerily silent, except for the occasional hum of a flickering light and the distant sound of water dripping from a cracked pipe. Jack had been working the night shift for almost a year now, and he had gotten used to the loneliness. He preferred it that way. No angry customers, no screaming kids, just him and the occasional car pulling in late at night. But something felt off tonight. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp concrete and something he couldn't quite place. He adjusted his cap and took a sip of the stale coffee from his thermos. The security camera showed nothing unusual. A few empty cars, the exit ramp leading to the main street. In the far corner of the garage where an old maintenance door stood shut, locked for years. He leaned back in his chair, trying to shake off the growing unease gnawing at him. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the motion sensor for the farthest section of the garage beeped. Jack straightened. That section was empty. No cars parked there, no reason for movement. His heart pounded as he switched to the corresponding camera feed. A woman stood in the corner. She was barely visible in the dim light, her long black hair draping over her face, her dress clinging to her body as if soaked. Her posture was unnatural stiff, almost as if she were struggling to stand upright. Jack's mouth went dry. His first instinct was to check the monitors again. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the overhead lamps. But Nosh was there, unmoving, in the same eerie position. He hesitated, then reached for the intercom. "Excuse me, miss, the garage is closed to pedestrians. Do you need assistance?" No response. His fingers hovered over the button for the emergency lights. Maybe a brighter view would show he was imagining things. Click. The lights flickered, then flared to life. She was gone. Jack's breath hitched, his eyes darting around the screen. The spot where she stood was empty, but the wet footprints remained. His stomach churned. Slowly he stood, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out of the security booth. His footsteps echoed through the empty space as he approached the far corner. The air grew colder. Jack shined his flashlight at the floor. The wet marks were real. Small, dark puddles soaked the concrete, leading toward the maintenance door. He swallowed hard. That door hadn't been opened in years. It was rusted shut, sealed from the inside. He turned back, shaking his head. Maybe the damp air was making him see things. Maybe a whisper, soft, like breath against his ear. He spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip. Nothing. His heart pounded as he backed away. "Okay, screw this," he muttered, picking up his pace toward the booth. The second he reached the door, the lights cut out. Pitch darkness swallowed the garage. Jack's breath came in short gasps. His fingers fumbled for the switch inside the booth. The power shouldn't have gone out. The generators always kicked in. Then, the sound of wet footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind him. Jack clenched his jaw. He didn't want to turn around, but some terrible instinct forced him to. In the faint glow of his flashlight, he saw the footprints forming one by one coming toward him, but there was no one there. His pulse hammered against his skull. He staggered back into the booth and slammed the door. locking it. His fingers found the security phone, but before he could dial, a sharp knock came at the glass window. Jack whipped around. The woman stood inches from him. Her face was still obscured by her wet, tangled hair, but he could hear her breathing ragged, strained, as if her lungs were filled with water. A dark stain spread across her dress, and as she pressed a hand against the glass, droplets of water trickled down. Jack scrambled backward. Then, she moved, her head tilted, her neck cracking with the motion. Slowly, painfully, her fingers dragged down the glass, leaving streaks of moisture. Her mouth, barely visible beneath the curtain of hair, opened, and a gurgling sound escaped her throat. Jack's body was frozen in terror. He knew he should run, but something held him in place. The woman's lips trembled, and in a voice that sounded like it was coming from deep underwater, she whispered, "Help me." The lights flickered back on. Jack blinked, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She was gone. The glass was dry. The wet footprints had vanished. Only the whisper lingered, echoing in the silence. Jack sat in the security booth, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly, his knuckles turned white. His breath was uneven, his heart pounding in his ears. The garage was silent again, but the memory of what had just happened clung to him like a cold, wet shroud. The woman, the whisper, the wet footprints. Had he imagined it? His gut told him no. Something was wrong with this place, something that had been lurking in the shadows long before tonight. He reached for the security phone, determined to call his supervisor and get the hell out of there. But before he could dial, a faint dripping sound caught his attention. Drip, drip, drip. Jack turned his head slowly toward the ceiling. A dark stain had begun spreading across the panel above him. Drip. A single droplet of water landed on the desk, forming a tiny puddle near his trembling fingers. Drip. Another droplet this time, onto his arm. It was ice cold. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The ceiling shouldn't be leaking. The upper level of the garage was sealed, and there hadn't been any rain in days. The lights above flickered again. The air grew heavy, damp, suffocating. The scent of stagnant water filled his nostrils. Then, the whisper returned. Closer this time, right behind him. "Help me." Jack spun in his chair, his heart lurching into his throat. She was inside the booth. The woman stood mere inches away, her soaked dress clinging to her frail frame, her long hair dripping onto the floor. He could see her face now, partially revealed through the strands of wet hair. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her lips tinged blue, her eyes wide, empty, filled with something dark and endless bored into him. Jack choked on a scream as she took a step forward. His survival instincts kicked in. He grabbed his flashlight and lunged for the booth door, yanking it open. He bolted into the garage, his feet slapping against the cold concrete. He didn't know where he was running, just needed to get away. But the garage had changed. The exit ramp that led to the street was gone, swallowed by darkness. The overhead lights buzzed and flickered like dying fireflies, casting jagged shadows along the walls. The space seemed to stretch endlessly, warping into something unfamiliar. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he turned a corner, searching for another way out. His radio crackled to life on his belt. Static. Then, a voice. Distant. Hollow. "Help me." Jack ripped the radio from his belt and threw it across the floor. It shattered into pieces. Then, the sound of water, not just dripping this time, rushing, like an unseen tide rising from below. Jack glanced down. Water was pooling at his feet, creeping up his ankles. It was murky, thick, carrying debris mall leaves, strands of hair, something that looked disturbingly like a fingernail. A chill ran down his spine. The sound of footsteps splashing through the water echoed behind him. Jack turned, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The woman was there, but this time, she wasn't alone. Dark shapes, dozens of them, began emerging from the water. Figures with sunken faces, hollow eyes, their bodies bloated and twisted, their movements jerky and unnatural. Jack stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run. The figures reached for him with waterlogged hands, their gurgling voices whispering in unison. "Help us!" Jack's vision blurred. The air was thick with moisture, pressing into his lungs, drowning him. He staggered, feeling the cold water climb up his legs, his chest. Then, a blinding flash. The emergency lights flared to life, bathing the garage in harsh white light. The figures were gone. The water had vanished. Jack found himself lying on the cold, dry concrete, gasping for breath. The security booth door was wide open. His radio was intact, lying on the desk. Everything was as it had been, except the maintenance door, the one that had been sealed shut for years. It was wide open now. Beyond it, a dark, narrow passage stretched into nothingness. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys, his bag, and ran. He didn't stop until he was outside, under the bright glow of the streetlights. He didn't even bother locking up. That was the last night Jack ever worked at the underground garage. The next morning, workers arrived to find the security booth abandoned. The cameras had recorded nothing unusual, just an empty garage. But when they reviewed the footage one last time, just before deleting it, something strange happened. For a brief moment only, a single frame there was an image. A woman standing in the far corner, her face obscured by wet, tangled hair. And right before the footage cut out, her lips moved. 2 words: "Help me." The screen went black, and the maintenance door, though welded shut, again had deep, wet footprints leading straight to it. For a brief moment only, a single frame there was an image. A woman standing in the far corner, her face obscured by wet, tangled hair. And right before the footage cut out, her lips moved. 2 words: "Help me." The screen went black, and the maintenance door, though welded shut, again had deep, wet footprints leading straight to it. Mark hated the night shift. The graveyard hours in St. Augustine Hospital were quiet, but they weren't peaceful. The long, sterile hallways echoed with every step, and the hum of flickering fluorescent lights created an uneasy drone. The worst place in the entire building was the basement morgue. There was no logical reason for it, but every attendant who worked in that room felt it the wrongness that clung to the air, like something waiting in the dark corners. At 3:12 a.m., just as Mark was pouring himself a stale cup of break room coffee, the security cameras flickered. He glanced at the monitor, frowning. The feed for the morgue had gone static for a second. Then, as the image sharpened again, he saw it. The lights were on. The morgue had been locked since Dr. Hanley signed off on the last body intake at noon. No one should have been there. Mark felt a cold spike of unease in his gut. Maybe it was just a power surge. Maybe maintenance had gone in without logging it. Maybe, but no. None of that explained why the lights had been off for hours and had just now turned on. With a deep breath, Mark grabbed his keys and radio and made his way downstairs. The air grew colder with each step. The automatic doors to the morgue slid open with a whispering hiss. The harsh white light was even more unsettling than the dark. A body was sitting up on one of the gurneys. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the man. George Henshaw, 72 years old, pronounced dead at 10:47 a.m. massive heart attack. The paperwork was still in the office, but there he was, his pale, wrinkled body wrapped in a hospital sheet, sitting stiff-backed, head bowed slightly forward, as if waiting for someone to speak first. Mark's fingers fumbled for his radio. Security to base." The radio crackled and died. Henshaw's head jerked upward. His eyes were wide open. They shouldn't be. Mark stumbled backward, knocking into the counter. Henshaw's mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, and a whispered reed, like wind through dead levis slid from his lips. "They put me in the wrong place." Mark's heart slammed against his ribs. "What?" A long silence. Then the body moved. Slow, unnatural cracking joints that had stiffened hours ago. The sheet slipped off his shoulders, revealing skin marred with deep purpling bruises. Henshaw's head tilted at an impossible angle. "They buried the wrong man," he murmured, his voice low and guttural. "And now, they don't want me here." A metallic clang echoed from the far end of the room. One of the cold storage units had unlatched itself. Then another, then another. The steel doors swung open one by one, and Mark saw movement inside. The bodies row, after row of them shifting beneath their sheets, stirring like restless sleepers about to wake. Mark bolted for the door. It slammed shut before he reached it. The lights flickered. When they steadied again, Henshaw was standing right in front of him. "You can't leave me here," he whispered, breath thick with decay. His hand reached out, grasping Mark's wrist with a grip like iron. Mark screamed as a searing cold shot through his veins, spreading up his arm, locking his muscles in place. Then, the lights went out completely. The darkness pressed in from all sides, thick, suffocating. Shapes moved in the pitch black, things unseen, brushing against Mark's skin, breathing in his ear. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, rising to a fever pitch of pleading, sobbing, rage. Then, silence. The lights snapped back on. Mark found himself standing alone. The gurneys were empty. The cold storage units were shut. The morgue looked exactly as it should have. Except for one thing. The toe tag on the nearest gurney now bore his name. Mark didn't remember screaming, but the next thing he knew, security was dragging him out of the basement. His voice hoarse, his hands shaking. He tried to explain, but they found nothing wrong. No sign of forced entry. No disturbances in the morgue. The cameras had only shown static for the last 10 minutes. The official report labeled it a panic attack. Mark quit the next morning. But some nights, when the new attendants worked the night shift, they still hear the whispers. And sometimes, the morgue lights turn on all by themselves. It started with a job posting. Night shift security guard needed at Holloway processing plant. Competitive pay. Immediate start. Desperate for work, I applied without a second thought. Within hours, I got a responsenio interview. Just a start date. That should have been my first warning. Holloway sat on the outskirts of town, an abandoned-looking facility that still somehow functioned. The main building loomed like a forgotten relic, rusted fences curling at the edges like dried paper. The air carried an acrid tang, like something long decayed but unable to fade completely. My first night was uneventful. I walked the perimeter, checked the cameras, made notes. The place was eerily quiet, save for the occasional hum of distant machinery. But that was normal, right? I convinced myself it was just another dull security gig, the kind that left me exhausted but paid the bills. Then came the second night. At around 2:13 a.m., a sound echoed through the security monitor, something clattering to the floor in the processing room. I switched to the corresponding camera, expecting to see a rodent or a stray piece of equipment shifting. Instead, the room was empty. A fallen metal tray lay in the center. I checked the logs. No one had entered or exited for hours. A logical explanation existed. It had to. I forced myself to believe it. Night 3 shattered that illusion. As I made my rounds, I passed the employee locker room. A noise came from inside, whispers, urgent but unintelligible. I swung the door open. Silence. Rows of rusting lockers greeted me, their doors ajar like yawning mouths. The air was stale, untouched for years, yet the whispering had been real. I checked each locker, one by one. Nothing. Then, as I turned to leave, I noticed something in the mirror above the sink. A figure. A man, tall and gaunt, stood at the far end of the room, his back to me. His uniform was Holloway issue, but something was off. The fabric clung too tightly to his form, stretched unnaturally. My heart pounded as I spun around. No one was there. The reflection remained. I ran. By night 5, I dreaded coming back. I told myself I needed the money, but that wasn't the real reason I stayed. It was curiosity, that suffocating need to know what was happening in that godforsaken plant. The graveyard shift crawled by, each minute heavier than the last. At 3:21 a.m., I heard a door slam shut. The sound came from the basement. I didn't even know there was a basement. My hands trembled as I unlocked the service door. The air beyond was thick with dust and something rotting. A concrete staircase led downward, swallowed in darkness. A single light flickered below. It revealed a narrow corridor lined with rusted metal doors. Some were sealed shut with chains, others slightly ajar. Faint scraping sounds drifted from behind them, rhythmic and deliberate. I should have turned back. I should have quit. Instead, I stepped forward. A guttural voice whispered my name. Then, the lights went out. A chill ran through me so sharp and sudden I gasped. The air felt thick, suffocating, like a presence pressing in from all sides. I fumbled for my flashlight, but my fingers were slick with sweat. The beam wavered as I lifted it, cutting through the pitch black. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly now, the walls closing in. From the darkness ahead, something moved, a slow, shuffling sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. My breath hitched. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were frozen in place. The dragging grew louder, closer. I forced myself to step forward, my flashlight trembling. The beam landed on a door, barely ajar. A handprint, smeared in something dark, marred the rusted surface. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached out, my fingers barely grazing the handle. The door slammed shut on its own. A guttural scream erupted from behind it, a human voice, distorted, filled with agony and rage. My flashlight flickered wildly, the walls vibrating as if the entire basement was alive. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence pressed in around me. My legs finally obeyed, and I stumbled backward, my breathing ragged. I turned and ran up the stairs, my footsteps echoing like gunshots. I burst through the door, locking it behind me. My chest heaved. The air in the plant now felt clean in comparison to whatever I'd just encountered below. I needed to leave, needed to quit. Yet, as I checked the monitors one last time, my blood ran cold. The basement camera I hadn't even noticed before was now active. The feed flickered, showing nothing but static at first. Then, for the briefest moment, an image came through. A face. Pale, sunken eyes locked onto mine through the screen, lips twisted into something between a snarl and a grin. The screen went black. A knock sounded at the security office door. I froze. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. My fingers hovered over the door handle, but every instinct screamed at me to stay put. The security office felt impossibly small now, its fluorescent lights buzzing erratically. The monitors flickered again. The basement camera had returned to static, but something shifted within the grainy black and white feed of shadow, stretching and bending, like something crawling toward the lens. The knock turned into pounding. My breath came in ragged gasps. Whatever was outside was no longer waiting for an invitation. The door handle rattled violently. I grabbed the flashlight, ready to fight, when suddenly the pounding stopped. Silence stretched thick and suffocating. A whisper seeped through the crack beneath the door. "Open up." My skin crawled. I backed away, heart hammering. The radio on my hip crackled again, but this time, the voice was unmistakable. "Help me." It was me. The voice was my own, distorted but pleading. I snatched up the radio and pressed the button, my voice shaky. "Who is this?" Only silence. Then, a sharp burst of static. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent ice down my spine. I turned back to the monitors, but the static had cleared from the basement camera. The feed now showed the stairwell, empty. Then, something moved at the bottom. A shadow, elongated and inhuman, slithered along the walls. I needed to leave. I bolted from the office, my footsteps deafening in the empty plant. The security gate was only 100 feet away, just beyond the main floor. If I could reach it, I could be free. But as I sprinted past the processing room, I stopped cold. The door was wide open. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of rot. Machines that hadn't functioned in years suddenly whirred to life, their gears grinding with an ear-splitting shriek. A conveyor belt shuddered, pulling along something wrapped in plastic, something human-shaped. The whispers returned, echoing through the room like a chorus of unseen voices. My name, over and over. Then a hand reached from the plastic. Fingers twitched, grasping at nothing. I stumbled backward, colliding with something solid. A hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun, expecting to see another security officer, or maybe the supervisor. Instead, I found myself staring into a face I knew all too well. My own, pale, sunken eyes, a twisted smile. My doppelganger grinned wider, the skin around its lips splitting like old leather. It leaned forward and whispered, "You should have left when you had the chance." I screamed. The lights exploded overhead. Darkness swallowed everything. When I woke, I was outside. The plant was dark, silent, untouched. My car was parked exactly where I left it. My hands trembled as I reached for the keys, desperate to escape. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The Holloway processing plant loomed behind me, its dark windows like watching eyes. And standing in the doorway, barely visible in the shadows, was me, smiling,